I don't know why I even pray. Sitting here together on a beautiful morning, it sounds a little bit ludicrous to think of such thoughts. Why do I even bother to pray? However, it is entirely possible, even likely, that someone either sitting here or hearing this on Facebook Live or hearing this in the future when it's posted on our YouTube channel, someone hearing this has at least been tempted to think a thought like this one due to either frustrations that are going on in their life or just being plain unhappy with the answer that God has given them. You ever thought about that? Sometimes we often are just thankful that God has finally answered our prayers. But other times, a lot of people have difficulty with the answer that God has given them. Why do I even bother to pray? Every answer that God has given me is an answer that I have not ever expected or an answer that I just don't like. I don't like that answer. Why do I even bother praying? If God's answers are just always going to be answers that I don't like or that I don't want. It may even be the case that someone hearing this at this moment is fed up with the way that God has been answering their prayers. If that be the case, then Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 1 through 19 has something to tell you. Something to say to you about being able to see God's love, care, power, and ability to care for his people through difficult times in life in the most difficult of ways in our lives. It seems appropriate in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 1 through 19. This will be our text this morning that we're going to focus on. And before we dive right into the text, it would seem to be appropriate to lay some groundwork to figure out the background and the setting of what's taking place in the book of Habakkuk. Well, first, not much is said or known about the prophet Habakkuk, about himself. Normally, what I mean by known about is the fact that where he's from, where he grew up, what his kinfolks are, who his father is. We don't have much details and information concerning about who the prophet is. But there has been some difficulty in the meaning of his name. But the Hebrew language seems to pinpoint the name Habakkuk to mean one who embraces. One who embraces. Personally, it seems that when we look at the context of the entire book, that would seem to be quite accurate. Habakkuk is one who embraces. Or at least in the book, he's learning how to embrace God's answer. It fits perfectly the context of the book because the first two chapters contain an exchange between the prophet and the Lord. Chapter 1, Habakkuk is wanting to know, what are you going to do? I mean, all these bad things are happening to your people, God, and I want to know, what are you going to do? I'm praying for them. What are you going to do? God tells them what he's going to do to the people. Well, chapter 2, Habakkuk doesn't like the answer. And God straightens him out and tells him, saying that it's not your job to understand or to know my plans, or even whether or not you like my answer. Your job is to write it down clear enough and simple enough for the people to read and to know what's going to happen. By the time we get to chapter 3, Habakkuk learns to embrace and accept that. Accept God's answer. Habakkuk is truly an example of faith. Whenever God gives you a difficult answer, remember the prayer of Habakkuk. It's not always about how your prayers are answered, but more who the one is that's answering your prayers. Sometimes we get too caught up on what the answer is going to be and how it's going to be answered, that we lose sight of who the one is that is answering our prayers. Folks, what Habakkuk is wanting to teach us this morning, and this is the main idea of our lesson, is that we must see the divine through the difficult. We must see the divine through the difficult. And I will say that the songs that we just sang really are songs that just fit perfectly with today's lesson. And, we didn't plan that. And so, I'd say that is, God's providence right there, putting things together. And the songs that we sang fit perfectly with really the whole theme of Hebrews and also even the theme of Habakkuk. We must see the divine through the difficult. So whenever God answers your prayers and they are answers that are difficult to accept and to embrace, I want you to remember the prayer of Habakkuk here in chapter 3, verse 1 through 19. And in his prayer, 3 individuals are going to be focused upon. Individual number 1, we're going to focus on the prophet. In his prayer, we see that the prophet had complete confidence. The prophet had complete confidence. Confidence in what? Well, obviously, confidence in the Lord and who he is. The prophet had complete confidence. And in the beginning of his prayer, we see that it is a prayer of fear and humility in God's presence. A prayer of fear and humility in God's presence. Look at verse 1 in the beginning of verse 2. It says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. I have heard the report of you. What is he referring to? He's referring back to God's answer. The exchange that they've been having back and forth of God's answer that he gave him, chapter 1 and chapter 2. I have heard the report of you and of your works, O Lord, do I fear. This section is introduced as a prayer of Habakkuk according to Shigionoth. Now, there seem to be many suggestions as what does Shigionoth mean. There's been a lot of difficult translations of that word and the meaning of it, but none seem any more clear contextually than for it to mean a highly emotional, poetic form of prayer. A highly emotional, poetic form of prayer. In other words, this prayer was an emotional, poetic outpouring of Habakkuk's faith to God. He saw the perplexities of life and heard God's answer in chapter 1. And it was an answer that he did not expect, and it was an answer that he obviously did not like. I'm bringing the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans, and I'm going to take Judah, yes, my people, into captivity. Wow. Really, God? Chapter 2, verse 1, Habakkuk said that he was going to wait for the Lord. Okay. I'm going to wait for you to justify your actions then. Tell me why. It's as if the prophet is implying that, God, if I were in your shoes, I'd probably do things a little bit differently. I don't like that answer. So what is your justification behind it? Justify your reason. Justify your actions for doing so. Justify your answer, because I don't like it. Well, upon looking at the perplexities of life, and upon waiting for God to justify his answer of why he is going to take his people into captivity, God tells Habakkuk, as mentioned earlier, that your job is not to understand it. Your job is not to figure it all out, what my plan and my purpose is that I have for you and your people. Your job is to write it down. Write it down, clear, simple enough, because I'm about to give you a vision. I want you to write it down, he says, chapter 2. And I want you to write it clear and simple enough for the people to understand, to know what's about to happen. If a person is going to be prideful and insist that God's answer is unfair, then there is something wrong with that man's soul. If a person becomes a little bit too prideful today, based on the answer that God has given you, that you've been praying about for such a long time, and you finally got an answer, and it's an answer that you did not expect, or an answer that you don't like, and you insist, due to pride, that you can do a better job, then there's something wrong with your soul. Not even within that, but maybe there's some answers that people have that God has already revealed for us through His Word. And when you find that answer, you are completely upset with it. I don't like that answer. My answer is better. I can do it myself. We talked a little bit about this morning of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4 as one of our lessons. God has laid out the foundation. He has given us the answer of how we can hold marriage in honor. And yet somebody, and many people today, don't want to do it that way. They don't like that answer. They insist to do it their own way. Well, this is my answer. My answer is that I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Well, and there's something wrong with your soul. Sad. Very sad. When we look at Habakkuk's prayer, his prayer reveals two elements in which we should add into our prayer life as well. Number one, there must be fear regarding God's awesome power and presence. He says, "Of your work, O Lord, do I fear." This Hebrew word for fear depicts one's entire body system undergoing terrific shock. Terrific shock. Look at verse 16. I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Habakkuk realized that Judah's punishment was inevitable. Whether or not he liked it, whether or not he could not stand God's answer to it, and whether or not he could comprehend his plan for it, it doesn't change the fact that Judah is going to be punished. It's inevitable. And recognizing Judah's impending doom and knowing from it, from whom it would come, Habakkuk was struck with fear. Second, that fear leads us to have humility. To have humility. Humility that results from fear. Yes, when we are standing before the awesome power and presence of God, knowing in the context of it, He's going to explain all the things that God can do, how He's in control of all things, which we're going to look at in our second point. He is just in all of His amazing power. And yes, likewise for us, we should have that same fear. We're not as big and bad as we think we are. We're not big and tough as we think we are. We think that we have all things figured out. No, we do not. Just when we think we do, we get crushed. We get brought down pretty low. And folks, when we stand before the awesome power of God, we too should be brought low, just like Habakkuk was. He now recognized God's right to do whatever He desired with the nation. His nation, His people turned their backs on Him. There needs to be punishment. In order to satisfy His wrath, there needs to be justice fulfilled in order for His wrath to be satisfied. And they need to learn their lesson. You're being punished. God says that He's not going to completely annihilate them. He's going to punish them for a while. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the Babylonians and free and save Judah. He talks about that in chapter 2. Humility caused Habakkuk's focus to shift. No longer was he desiring to get the answer that he wants. All he cared about was that God's glory was seen. Folks, may our whole focus be upon God's glory. May we pray that the divine will triumph throughout the earth. Let us humble our desires and be concerned only that the progress of righteousness endures and continues throughout the earth. Is that not what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6? Let us humble ourselves before the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt us in his proper time. God answers the way he wants to answer. He will answer when he wants to answer. Why? Because he knows what's best. He has a plan. He has the purpose all figured out. It's not our job to understand and try to comprehend as to why this answer. Our job is not to do that. Our job is to keep our focus on God's glory, for it to be seen. So his prayer was a prayer of fear and humility. And we also see that it was a prayer of acceptance to God's answer. A prayer of acceptance to God's answer. The last part of verse 2, Habakkuk says, in the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. In wrath, remember mercy. Although God's wrath must be satisfied, Habakkuk pleads to the fact that God is a merciful God. He says, I know you're just, but I know that you're also a merciful God. And so during your wrath, while your wrath is being satisfied, just remember mercy. Remember mercy. Although Habakkuk does not understand why God chose the Babylonians, he accepts and knows that God will make it right. It also serves as a connotation that Habakkuk has given in and decides to talk about it no more. He says, okay, God, I now understand. I understand who you are. I may not understand your answer, but I understand who you are. And you are a God who has the right to do whatever he wants to do. But I know that you are also just a God of mercy. So please, just within that, just remember mercy. That's it. I'll stop talking about it. That's it. He had previously waited for God to justify his action or justify his answer, chapter 2, verse 1. But now he will wait for God to work out his divine plan. Look at verse 16. He says, yet, the end of it, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. He says in verse 17, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. I see the end of verse 16, along with verse 17, 18, and 19. I see it as an acknowledgement that's very similar to Jesus' statement. Not my will, but thine be done. Luke chapter 22, verse 42. Not my will, but thine be done. No matter how bad things get, we are to trust and submit to the Lord's will. I will wait for the day of trouble to happen on our enemies. And yet for us, in our circumstance, if our economy is completely gone, our food, our farms, our crops, our supplies are just completely wiped out. If there's no economy, no money, no material possessions, no material prosperity, no more food, no more supplies, I'm still going to trust and submit to your will, Lord. Is that easier said than done? I think for a lot of us it is. Folks, Jesus himself, he knew what God's divine plan was, what the Father's divine plan was. Does that mean that he liked it? No. 3 times he prayed, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thine be done. He knew what was going to happen. He did. He knew the pain, the suffering, the death that he was going to go through. He knew about the resurrection. Yes, he already knew the plan. But that still does not mean that he had to like it. Who would like to have to suffer and be tormented on a painful cross hours upon hours? I don't. I don't think anybody would. Jesus, he did not have to like the answer, but he knew that it had to be done, and he knew that his Father had a plan. He knew that his Father had the plan laid out for him. And still he said, your will be done, not mine. Likewise, when we learn to wait for God's answer, for him to answer our prayers, and when we accept and embrace his answer with complete confidence, an abiding joy will result. Look at verse 18 and 19. He says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. Christians may not rejoice in the bitter circumstances that come in life, but we can rejoice in the fact that God is the sovereign ruler and nothing can hinder his will. Let us rejoice in who God is, what he has done for us, and what he continues to do for us. Even if an invading army comes today and takes out our nation, wipes out our economy, wipes out all of our financial prosperity, materialistic prosperity, and we fall under their rule, can we still be able to say, I rejoice in the God of my salvation? Hope so. Habakkuk was able to have complete confidence in his faith to say a thing like that. The invading enemy's coming. We're going to be held in captivity. But I rejoice in the God of my salvation. Folks, even if a virus outbreak destroys the economy so that there is no food, we will say, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. Do we have that kind of faith? What if God, judging this nation, causes us to be ruled by another, as I mentioned? Folks, we may think that, that such a thing could never happen. Well, the people of Judah were thinking such a thing, were they not? There are many nations out there that do not like us. They want us gone. What if God, by judging this nation, causes us to be ruled by another? Will we be able to still say, the Lord, I rejoice in the Lord of my salvation. He is my strength. Will the Lord be your strength, or will you give in to despair? Individual number 2 that we look at in Habakkuk's prayer is the Lord. Habakkuk, the prophet, had complete confidence. Number 2, the Lord has complete command. Complete command. You can also put control if you want to, but I like command. It fits perfectly with the context. He has complete command. When you look at verse 3, Habakkuk says, God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. In verse 3, we have what might be known as a theophany. You know how I am when it comes to big words. You don't have to remember that big technical word. But I'd like for you to remember the simple definition of it. A theophany is either a physical or a figurative appearance of God to man. A physical or figurative appearance of God to man. 2 examples that we see of that. of a physical appearance of God to man is think of God's appearance to Moses through the burning bush. Was that a physical appearance? Yes, but it was done by a burning bush where the fire was not consuming the bush. And he was speaking to Moses. Second, we also see a physical appearance in the book of Joshua with the commander of the Lord's army. We see that Joshua falls before and worships this commander. But the commander does not say, hey, get up, for I'm just a man. No. The commander accepted the worship. What does that make you think? Was that God? Was that a theophany? It would appear so. Here we see another example right here in Habakkuk 3, but it's not a physical one. It's a figurative appearance of God to man. And notice how he is portrayed. The word God in Hebrew here in Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 3, is the word Elohah, which is the singular form for God the Father, who is all divine and all powerful. If you remember a few weeks ago in one of our Psalm sermons, he uses the word Elohim, which is the plural form of God, which represents the three persons of the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But here it's Elohah, the singular form to represent God the Father, who is all divine and all powerful. Now, on top of that, this word came in Hebrew is an ancient military term that referenced the entrance of the army's best and greatest warrior. The same word is used in reference to Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 14. There it says that Goliath was the champion of the Philistine army, and he came out to the battlefield. A word that was used to represent the army's greatest, most powerful, mightiest warrior. Here, we see God as a divine warrior. A divine warrior full of praise. In Judah's memory, God went forth before his people as their mightiest warrior against their oppressors, using the forces of nature as his weapons. He'll continue on through the rest of his prayer, talking about what God will do, and what he has done and what he will do as the mightiest warrior. He goes on to say that he is a divine warrior of power. In verse 4 through 15, we won't read all of it. As Habakkuk realized that God's work would be revived, he realized that God was in command of all things. Verse 5, he's in command of the plagues and the pestilence. Verse 6 through 11, he has full command over the hills, the mountains, the rivers, the seas, the moon, and the sun. And what he has done are things that he has done in the past. Habakkuk wants to remind the people of Judah of what God had done in the past and suggested that he would act in a similar way in the future. You recall about the time when the sun stood still in the days of Joshua? What about the plagues and the pestilence? What does that remind you of? Egypt? See, he is bringing up the past, the history of God's people, and saying, you remember what our divine warrior, our mightiest warrior, God had done for you in the past? Well, guess what? This same divine warrior is going to do these things to you. To you. This is what God, the mightiest warrior, is going to do when he punishes you. And this is what he will do in the future to destroy Babylon and to save you out of captivity. Folks, this being the case, our confidence should be renewed in that God has not ceased fighting as our greatest and mightiest warrior. God's absoluteness offers Christians an absolute promise that he will vindicate the saved and render misery to all who reject unrighteousness. Those who have attempted to hinder God's purpose will find themselves unable to stand before God's when God's judgment comes. Revelation chapter 6, verse 17. Folks, the third and the final individual that we see in Habakkuk's prayer is the sinner. The prophet had complete confidence. The Lord has complete command. Well, Habakkuk mentions about the sinner. He says the sinner will have complete collapse. The sinner will have complete collapse. Verse 7, he says that I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Look over at verse 14, the end of verse 13 and 14. He says, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. Here he gives descriptions of what God has done and will do to the sinner. He will bring them complete collapse. He will bring them complete collapse in distress. Sinners today might brutally exercise power now, but they will not do so forever. Eventually, the stubborn in heart will have to admit God's sovereignty, to have to admit his rule. The arrogant heart will have to admit that God is indeed the ruler of all and in control of all things. And the proud will discover that they have believed a lie in thinking that moral achievements are the ultimate rewards. They will see God's awesome presence and utterly collapse in distress. They will see God's power and they will utterly collapse in destruction. You have crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. In other words, you've destroyed him. You've destroyed him. When they see God's awesome presence, the sinner will be in distress. They will tremble at the awesome presence of God. And when they see God's awesome power, when they see his awesome power, they will collapse in destruction. The world's ruling powers may present themselves as powerful in warfare, but their military greatness cannot protect them from God's wrath. Folks, think about today. Recently, Christians have been blamed for the continuing spreading of the virus because they continue to meet in the worship assembly on Sunday mornings. Well, two things. Number one, yeah, they accuse us, but they never show any factual evidence. And number two, did not Nero in the New Testament blame Christians for the fire at Rome? A little bit of similarities. Are there not? Why? Why do they do that? Well, they want to shift blame on other people. And it's also injustice, it's unrighteousness. And yeah, who's the easy target to throw under the bus? Christians. Why? Because we don't retaliate. We don't seek vengeance. Because God is our vengeance. He's the one with all the power who will vindicate us. And so folks, even today, the world's power, thinking that they have all authority, they have all power to blame Christians today for the spreading of a ridiculous virus or spreading lies and false accusations for the fire of Rome. They can try to assume and believe a lie into thinking that they have so much power, but in the end, they will find out that they do not. Judgment is coming. But this time it will not be to convince the unrighteous to come back to God. See, judgment there, the punishment against Judah, was to convince them that God is in control, but also convince them to come back to him. But now this time, folks, universal judgment is coming. And it's not to convince the unrighteous to come back, because by then it will be too late. The unrighteous must come back to God before judgment, or it will be too late. And folks, you and I as Christians, we must understand the urgency of this fact. Why? Because two things. One, it will help us to live a godly life. Knowing that he's coming back, it will encourage us to continue on living a godly life. Being confident, being faithful into God, knowing that we may not comprehend the answer, but he's in control of all things. He knows what's best and that he will work it out. And number two, it will help us to avoid living an ungodly life. So really there's two things that help us to remain faithful and to help us to keep away from ungodliness and to avoid the power of his wrath. Folks, we must see the divine through the difficult. When you look at the prophet who had complete confidence, he struggled for a long time, did not like the answer, but he was convinced and convicted of who God is. And he had complete confidence in him. Number two, we see that the Lord has complete command over all things. He's in control of everything. He's got it figured out. He knows what he's doing. And number three, we see that the sinner will have complete collapse. Folks, when trials appear to be tipped in the favor of evil, remember that his ways are everlasting. Chapter 3, verse 6. When things get desperate in your life, remember the short prophecy of Habakkuk. When God's answers are difficult and hard to get by, look to Habakkuk and see the divine through the difficult. Folks, when we look at the New Testament, we see another group of people who looked to the answer of who the Messiah was to be, what he is to do when he comes. And when they heard the fact that the coming of the Messiah must suffer and die, they didn't like that. They did not like that answer. And so what did they do? They rejected it and decided to make an answer of their own. Oh, he's going to come in a physical military appearance, and he's going to physically establish Jerusalem. We're going to physically reign for 1,000 years. We're going to be physically conquering this entire earth. See, that's what they wanted. That's the answer they wanted. But folks, they were wrong. They were wrong. They did not understand. They refused to understand. They didn't want to listen. They refused to listen. And they willingly rejected the answer of Jesus Christ. Folks, today, there are many out there who are looking for the answer. Are we going to be the ones to share them the answer that God has given us? And folks, if they are the ones who don't like it, they don't want it, that's on them. It's on them. But folks, we must do what we can, just as Habakkuk had the responsibility to share it with other people, to preach it to other people in a simple and clear way for them to understand. We have that responsibility as well, because judgment is coming. And so, folks, this morning, are you here? Are you here knowing that you have been struggling recently with the answers that God has given you in your prayers? Well, if you are, as I always say, look to Habakkuk. Look to Habakkuk and remember his prayer and see the divine through the difficult. If you're here this morning, if you're needing prayers of encouragement, if you're needing prayers of strength to help you endure and to help you to have a stronger faith to keep on keeping on during a time like this, then we encourage you to please come forward. We can help you in any way together as we stand and as we sing the song of invitation.